Okay, let's get back into chapter 5. So we finished with Charles Darwin, who didn't really know what was being passed on. He could just see it happening, and it was a fact. You can observe changes taking place, but he didn't know what the mechanism for things being passed through generation after generation was. And one thought at the time was Chevalier de Lamarck. We now call this Lamarckism, and it is totally inaccurate. It's totally wrong, but it was a kind of a okay idea at the time, but we know that it doesn't work. And Lamarck proposed that characteristics could be acquired in lifetime. So if you were, let's say, a giraffe and you were constantly straining to get some high leaves with your neck, that straining would be passed on to your next generation, and they would have slightly longer neck than the generation before them. And then that one would strive for higher and higher, and then eventually you'd have these long-necked giraffes, right? Totally wrong. This doesn't work. Let me put it in another way, or that will seem crazy or ludicrous to you. I work out, pump iron, lift weights. My child's going to have big, strong muscles, right? It doesn't work. That is the principle of acquired characteristics, and it is not. It's not scientific. It doesn't work. But what does happen? Well, Darwin was sort of non-committal about it. Most people thought that characteristics were like a paint pot, where you had a red and blue, and then the outcome was green. So you had just sort of a mixture of characteristics, but they didn't really know how that functioned or operated. In a monastery in Austria, Gregor Mendel was discovering the secret, and he actually published the results of his investigations in his pea garden in a obscure monkish German language publication that nobody read. So published in the right place, I guess. Darwin never read Mendel. He never knew about genetics. But Mendel had discovered genes, and he had discovered a very important principle, which we call the principle of independent assortment. That is to say, Gregor Mendel never saw or was able to pick up or isolate what a gene was. But he proposed that there must be something that is, at least to his eyes, invisible, that was independent units of characteristics that are recombined from generation to generation and then may show up later on. Now, the way that he did this was really clever, and we still use this as a way to sort of interrogate genetics in what we call a Punnett square. And what this is, you've probably done things that are similar in mathematics because it's a pretty basic concept. That what Gregor Mendel did is he had different varieties of pea plants. And let's say take one characteristic of a pea plant. Every organism, everything has to have a size, right? It can be small, it can be tall, right? But it's got to be some size. And what he did was he had two strains of pea plants. One was a tall variety and one was a short variety. And he could test that these were only short by breeding them with one another over and over and over again, and you would get only after 100 generations, you would only get short plants that were being bred, right? The same you could do for the tall plants. 100 generations and you'd only get tall plants. Fine? No problem. So you have a purebred tall pea plant, a purebred short pea plant. What happens when you combine the tall and the short? Well, you have the short characteristic that can be represented by, let's call them two lowercase t's, right? And then you have the tall variety on the other axis of a box with 4 squares in it. So you've got small t, large t, large t. Okay? So those are the characteristics that you have one plant with the two capital T's and one plant with two lowercase t's. Now what happens when you combine the tall with the short? Well, in those four boxes you have one tall, one small, one tall, one small, one tall, one small, and one tall, one small. So 100% of that first generation is a combination of a large T, small t. So the characteristics that you see are, all of those offspring are the product of a tall plant and a short plant breeding together to create this hybrid. But what he observed is that in terms of what they looked like when they grew up, he couldn't see, he knew, you know, that's just a mathematical sort of thing that he did, right? But what they looked like were all tall plants. So when they grew, they all grew tall. 100% of these. So let's say there were four of them, four offspring, all four of them were tall. They looked tall. So we've done that before, where we took tall plants and bred them with tall plants, right? And they were only tall. So one hypothesis would be that, okay, the tall plant destroys the small plant's characteristic entirely. You'll never see a small plant again. But what happens in the second generation is extremely illustrative. What he did is we took the capital T, small t, which looks like a tall plant, and he bred it to another capital T, small t, and did the same Punnett square with four boxes. And what ended up was being two capital T's, down here, two small t's, and 50%, these two boxes were capital T, small t. So, like you started with. That means that 75% of them look tall, but you've got this one plant, 25% of them, that comes out looking short. And it can only be short if it is a pure bred short plant. It only has the characteristic of short plant. And you could breed that with, you can test this by breeding with other short plants over and over and over again. It will only produce short plants. You can do the same thing with the pure tall pea plant with other tall pea plants. It will be over and over and over again only tall. But if you breed those two that have the capital T, small t with one another, they will do the same pattern again. 25%, 25%, 50%. So one of those characteristics did not eliminate, but it masked those characteristics. And it created actually this really weird variety amongst the second generation. The first generation was all tall, but the second generation was actually quite variable. You had three different types of plants. Now, like I said, every organism has to be a size, right? So that is created by the genes that you get, or the characteristics that you get from your parents. But what size you are is what we call an allele, which is a variation on the same thing. So we all have color to our eyes. Some people have brown eyes, I have blue eyes, some have green eyes, some have hazel eyes, these sorts of things. We all have eyes, we all have color to our eyes, but what color it is an allele. And so the short and tall are alleles of the same characteristics. And those alleles can be combined independently of one another. And this is the law of independent assortment. So even though he couldn't peer into the DNA or the genetics of peas, Gregor Mendel had identified the way that characteristics pass from generation to generation. It's not body parts, it's something hidden that he couldn't see. We now actually have photographed DNA. We know what it looks like. We've been able to unravel it. We know a lot about DNA now, about what genes are, about what genetics are. But at the time, this was revolutionary, and it was only discovered after, sometime after Darwin and natural selection had come up with this. So this is important because natural selection is selecting characteristics for survival, but what gets passed down are the genes. And if those genes have produced an organism that is capable of surviving and passing on those genes to the next generation, that is what natural selection is selecting. And a dominant gene is always manifest in the next generation, which would be the tall pea plant, and a recessive gene is one that actually stays hidden, but might crop up if the correct combination of alleles comes together to allow it to manifest. And then you have other ones that are called co-dominant, other alleles that actually can sort of blend together, and that is closer to the paint pot theory. You can also have, yes, okay. Just as by way of giving a name to those pea plants, the purebred tall pea plants are what we call homozygous, meaning they have identical alleles, whereas heterozygous, the hybrid ones in those two boxes, or the first generation of 4, would be heterozygous, which is mixed alleles. And it's important because the natural selection is only selecting for survival organisms that survive, which means that it's not really about your genes, it's about what your genes tell you to become. So you can have a recessive allele hidden down there someplace that doesn't manifest itself, but it can crop up later. And that can be just the variety that natural selection is looking for, or it can be a killer to you. So, but it's important to I guess point out that natural selection either selects everyone for survival, or it selects or everyone for survival or for destruction, or it selects individuals that have a variant that is better suited for that environment. In other words, natural selection needs variety in order to work. There needs to be something to select. If there's nothing to select and the conditions become unfavorable, that means that's where the extinctions come about, right? That's where everybody gets wiped out. If there's no variation, everybody's done for eventually. But if there is variation, what might be a sort of a marginal survival or a maladaptation could be, in a changing environment, just the thing that nature selects for success. So it's variety that's extremely important for natural selection to work. And the law of independent assortment actually enhances variety. And in fact, sexual reproduction is a process that really builds variety into the whole system. That sexual reproduction combines the genetic makeup of one parent with another parent to create something that has never been seen before, because it's a unique combination of those two, of half of the genetic material of one and half of the genetic material of another, to be something that's brand new to nature. So that's not even enough, right? That's not even the end of the story. So reproduction creates variety just by recombining these alleles, by independent assortment. But nature has another chance to do even something more dramatic than just a reshuffling of the characteristics that have been there before. And this is what we refer to as mutations. And this is the only source of new alleles in nature. There's no other source of new alleles. You either get it from a dominant or recessive or a codominant allele from one of your parents, or you don't get it at all. With the exception of a copying error, that if you are combining things together, there is a chance that nature provides that you actually may do something where, whoops, I missed that. I didn't copy that that gene right, and you get passed on down something that is totally new to nature. Now, most mutations are benign, and you may have a mutation and you never even know that you have it. a mutation can be debilitating or life-threatening. Or a mutation can be just the thing that makes you survivable and better able to survive than your competitors. So nature is going to, I hate to say it, is going to kill us all, right, eventually. But it's whether you live long enough to pass your genes down to the next generation. And if your mutation is the thing that makes you more successful, then nature will see that repeated through more reproduction, and then that characteristic will be passed on. So it's brand new to nature, but it could be successful. It also could be the opposite of successful. It could be debilitating. Now, let's talk a little bit about the way this works. Deoxyribonucleic acid is DNA, and we've now unraveled this molecule, which doesn't require any thought. It doesn't think. It doesn't have intentions. DNA isn't trying to do anything. If it exists, it exists, and if it replicates itself, then it does, and you'll see it again, right? If it doesn't, that's it. And it doesn't care. It doesn't have emotions or feelings. It's just a molecule. That's all it is. The way I like to describe it is it's like magnets, right? So you don't have to think that a magnet is, oh, I'm so attracted to you, I'm going to pull myself towards you. You know, it doesn't have emotion about its fellow magnet. And it also isn't repulsed emotionally by a negatively charged magnet that it's pushed away from, right? The same thing goes for the molecules in DNA. You've got adenine is always attracted to thymine, A or T, and guanine is always attracted to cytosine. And those are the only things. It's A with T, and G with C, always. You will never get a G with a T. It can't happen. They're negatively charged magnets, so to speak. And if you have enough of these magnets and you throw them in a bag and you shake them up, they're going to find their attractors and they're going to repel their negatives, right? That's what DNA really is. It's a code that gives instructions for cells to do operations. You started out with, your parents each produced a sex cell that combined with the other sex cell that came together. Each of them had 23 chromosomes, which is DNA compressed into a little package. And your mother gave 23 and your father gave 23. And these came together, combined into one cell called a zygote. And you started out as one single cell. You were a single-celled organism at one point. Once enough nutrition got into that cell nucleus and all of these DNA molecules formed a chain, then it split, combined with those same over here, and then you had 2 DNA strands in that nucleus, and then the cell split into 2. So you were once one-celled organism. Enough nutrition came in to duplicate your DNA strand, then your cell split and you were 2 cells, and then 4 cells, and then 16 cells, and now you're 1 trillion cells or more. And each one of those cells in your body reproduces in that same way by getting nutrition, replicating the DNA strand, and splitting. And the DNA strand tells the cell what to do. All of your life's instructions for building you are encoded in this. So a heart cell has the entire DNA strand in there, but it is told to be a heart cell rather than a brain cell or a blood cell or a muscle cell or a bone cell. All of your body cells reproduce through this simple act of duplication. It's the simplest way it can work. But sex cells are specialized cells. They're the only cells that don't function that way. And in fact, you don't even have the ability to produce sex cells until you reach a certain age, till you survive long enough for your DNA to be activated for sexual reproduction. Once you reach that age, then you start to produce what are called gametes, which are sex cells. And those reproduce differently. They start out just the same way. They duplicate and they create two cells, but then those two cells separate again, creating 4 cells that don't have the 46 chromosomes that your normal body cells have, but 23 chromosomes that are intended's the wrong word, that are for exclusive use in sexual reproduction. So they require a sexual partner to be combined with to produce the next generation, the next zygote, right? So that's the offspring. So this is the way cell division works. And importantly, in that the normal somatic cells, your body cells, reproduce by what is called mitosis, mitosis. And sex cells, your gametes, reproduce or duplicate and actually quadruplicate themselves by another process called meiosis, M-E-I-O-S-I-S. And meiosis is more complicated because in that the first split between sex cells is it splits into 2 46 chromosome cells, and then again into 23 and 23. That's where we get 23andMe and all of these DNA profiling things, right? So in that second split, where you have 4 daughter cells at the very end, there's actually an opportunity for mutations to occur, for what's called crossing over. So whole segments of genes can switch, and a gene is just a segment of your DNA strand that gives instructions for certain characteristics to occur. So my blue eyes are a stretch of my DNA strand that told my body to create blue rather than brown. And it was because I had 2 parents that had light-colored eyes that were able to express the recessive allele of blue eyes. If I had one parent who had brown eyes, I would probably have brown eyes in that case. So a gene is just a segment of your DNA strand, a segment which is compressed into a chromosome, and that gives instructions for your body to do stuff, right? It's just like blueprints. And so crossovers can be switching this around. Now, this is important because it is another opportunity for variation. And that's what natural selection is acting upon. So that all of the opportunities for more variations, the better. But it's all based on the same chromosomes that your successful parents were able to